sadness and irritability, and they don't like feeling that way, they'd be likely to seek out substances to self-medicate those emotions. And particularly amongst people who have already had an addiction onset, people with who are high in emotionality have a very difficult time quitting and maintaining recovery, especially in the face of stress. So next I want to talk about the impulsive personality. So people high in impulsivity, they tend to make quick decisions without thinking about the long-term consequences, make rash decisions, seek out new experiences. They like things that are novel and exciting and stimulating. Now, it's not all bad. These people are highly extroverted. They tend to be the life of a party and can sometimes be grandiose, but they're often very creative. And so, this trait has some adaptive and maladaptive features to it. But as you might expect, this could be a predisposing factor because you talk about someone who's highly impulsive and makes quick decisions without thinking. If someone puts a drug in front of them and says, hey, take that. Well, what is that? Oh, just take it. You'll like it. I mean, they'd be likely to pop that pill in their mouth and go with it. And this is also problematic in terms of the research showing that impulsivity is associated with relapse. People who are in recovery and are trying to maintain recovery, their thoughts can change on a dime, and they can make a decision to say, hey, you know what, screw it. Tonight, I'm just going to enjoy myself. I'm going to get really high, and I'm going to worry about tomorrow. Okay, lastly, I'm going to talk about this trait of anhedonia, and this might be a little less familiar to you guys in the audience. But people who are highly anhedonic tend to experience less pleasure out of activities in their life and are less interested in certain activities. So we're talking about normal activities that most people would find pleasant, like social interactions, hobbies, and whatnot. And people who are high in anhedonia aren't necessarily interested, or they don't find much pleasure out of those things. Now, it does have some adaptive qualities because we're talking about people who are generally more emotionally flat, so they're less affected by stress, and also they tend to conserve the resources because they don't seek out extravagant, expensive experiences. But even though they may not experience much pleasure, they nonetheless, do have a basic need to feel pleasure. So what the research shows is that these individuals do tend to have higher rates of substance use disorders. And some of the reports suggest that, these drugs allow them to feel more normal. They can pharmacologically produce pleasure in a way that they couldn't find pleasure out of typical activities that are non-chemical in nature. Okay, so thus far, I've talked about a pathway such that you might have a particular genetic profile which should cause you to be high in certain personality traits, which could in turn increase your predisposition to addiction. But it's also interesting to note that genes can have a more direct effect on addiction because genes alter people's acute responses to drugs of abuse. So if you talk to people or, when I used to do clinical work talking to addicts, so someone who's abusing marijuana would say, oh, I never really liked cocaine. It made me anxious and jittery. That wasn't my thing. And the cocaine addict will say, I never really understood pot. It didn't really do much for me, but cocaine, that makes me feel good. So maybe part of that's psychological, but what research is showing is that if you have a certain genetic variant which codes for a neurophysiological makeup, which actually makes you more sensitive to the acute euphoric effects of a drug, then you, once you experiment with the drug, are more likely to go on to abuse the drug. So Tom was talking about the opioid system. Research suggests that if you have a certain genetic variant, you have different levels of mu opioid receptors in your brain, which is important because alcohol has a much stronger euphoric effect when you drink it. So these are issues which take you right from a genetic predisposition to a potential addiction liability, regardless of whether or not you have one of these so-called addictive personality traits. Okay, so this now kind of really screws things up, okay? Because genes can actually alter your environment. So in the field, we call this a gene-environment correlation. So genes, as I was telling you earlier, alter your personality, but people with different personality traits tend to seek out different environments or actually cause their environment to react to them. So, for example, I was talking about people who are high in impulsivity. Now, these individuals are more likely to seek out deviant peers, for example, because they want to try something that's exciting and cool and new. And these peers could introduce them to a drug that they may never, ever get exposed to, and hence the cycle begins. So that's an example where a gene can actually cause you to seek out a different environment. Also, genes can actually alter your environment. So if you're high in emotionality, so you have a lot of high highs and a lot of low lows, being in a relationship with a person like that is stressful. Okay? Yeah, some people are laughing. Yeah, some of us have been there. So your partner can get stressed out, and they're going to experience their own emotions. And as a result, you, the person with the predisposition, oh my God, I'm so stressed out. My partner's like so sad, so down in the dumps all the time. She's not giving me the support that I need anymore. That's an example of where genes can actually alter your environment through personality, and that can come around and even exacerbate your propensity for an addiction. Okay, so what do you take out of this talk? Okay, so I'm trying to give you guys a broad overview. If you take anything out of this talk, so get past the idea nature versus nurture, genes versus environment, or how much is it environment, how much is it genes? We all agree it's both. And what I hope you learn from this talk is that it's complex. Okay, genes, personality, and the environment are intertwined and have intimate interrelationships in determining your predisposition to addiction. So where is the research going? What's it doing right now? Where is it going in the future? Because I'm just giving you a general outline of this general field. Well, some of the research in my lab and in other institutions, we're trying to identify specific predisposing pathways. We want to identify a specific gene or set of genes which lead to a certain personality profile, which in turn influences your risk of addiction. Okay? And if we can identify specific pathways, because as you all know by doing the show, not everyone ends up suffering from an addiction via the same path or route. There are multiple routes. But if we can identify some of these patterns or trends, that's going to be of great theoretical importance. And perhaps more importantly, is using this information for interventions. And one thing that I think is encouraging is often when people think about a genetic predisposition, they go, oh, no, I have a genetic predisposition. My dad's an alcoholic. My grandpa's an alcoholic. My uncle's an alcoholic. What am I going to do? It doesn't necessarily mean that you're destined to develop an addiction. Because what this idea and this area of research suggests is that you can actually target this intermediate personality trait which channels someone's risk. And actually, you could potentially prevent addictions. So just a brief example, if you know that someone might have a gene which encodes, or a set of genes which encode for an emotional personality, if you can teach them at a very young age how to cope with negative emotions and not try to escape them, that could potentially prevent the onset or exacerbation of addiction at an older age. And the other thing is, potentially preventive medications could be of use. So earlier I talked about the fact that genes can alter your neurophysiology such that you are actually more sensitive to the drug of abuse. And once you try it, you're going to get hooked potentially. Dr. McClellan was talking about these vaccines. Okay, I think this is a very exciting area of research. And although there's some ethical considerations about this, can you imagine if we identified a set of genes such that if this person actually got exposed to the drug, it's a pretty high chance that they would develop an addiction to it. If we can vaccinate them at a younger age before they try it, you know. Okay, so I said leave this up to the policy and the health professionals, but in terms of research, it's worth understanding. So anyway, this is just scratching the surface of this whole area of research, but I think it's really exciting. I hope that you guys take something out of this, and we'll have to see what happens in the future. Thank you. And here's my contact information. Please feel free to contact me if you have any questions.
Okay, thank you both. That's very, very interesting, very informative, helpful. A lot of the things I think, most of us kind of feel like we understood on some level from observing it, but it's certainly enormously valuable to have it explained like that. So we're going to open up the floor for questions for anybody, but I'll just start with Dr. McClellan. I guess one of the things that we see all the time and we wonder about is, it seems like there's some kind of tension between what you were talking about in the existing recovery community, which is principally done by counselors, and a sort of medicalized model, which says, okay, there's a drug for that. How can you, because for exactly that reason, it seems ironic that there would be a drug to help you with a drug addiction, and isn't that avoiding an underlying psychological issue?
Yeah, it's one of the most common but false dichotomies, actually. If you go right to the big book that Bill Wilson wrote, you'll see that it says, we're doing what we're doing until we find medications that will be able to help. Bill Wilson was a very big supporter of methadone, for example. But it is also true that culture has gone on over these, from the 1930s when AA started. And it's true that most addicted people have gotten into recovery not from treatment but directly through AA. That's a fact. And of course that culture is strictly abstinence oriented. So that definition that I showed you, when we negotiated that, we went directly to one of the several seats of that kind of thinking, Betty Ford. And we started this way. So look, if you were taking insulin, but were otherwise abstinent, would you still be considered in recovery? And everybody said, absolutely, sure, of course. Well, how about an antidepressant medication? Yeah, sure, you could still be in it. Well, then how about a medication that is treating your addiction? Could you still be in recovery? Or is there only one way? And after quite a bit of discussion, it was widely agreed, and now I think is really pretty accepted, that there are many ways to get into recovery, and that you can be in stable recovery while taking insulin for your diabetes, an antidepressant medication for your depression, and naltrexone to prevent you from relapsing on alcohol. It's no great character loss to give yourself every opportunity